Welcome to the Tons of Industry Show. Today I've got a special guest with us for the first time. Prince, who is a renowned journalist, an author, and a speaker, is here with us to discuss central banks and what's going on. Her new book is called Collusion, and I really resonated with one of her remarks that every crisis starts with a group of people doing something completely foolish until it's too late. And today we'll be discussing economic history. So if you're at work or at home or sitting back with a cup of coffee or some tea, if you'd like to know how we got to our global position today, this is a key interview for you. Nomi, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me on.
Nomi, what is the principal role of a central bank in theory if the idea was implemented in the proper way?
That's an excellent question. The official role, and it differs slightly from country to country, but the official role of central banks is to ensure that there's an adequate amount of money supplied to the system at a rate that allows that particular central bank to also monitor the inflation within that country, as well as, in our case, in the case of the Federal Reserve, for example, the employment or full employment attributed to that country. So their role is really to balance the two, as well as to regulate the banking system or the financial system within their purview.
Of course, when you say money, you mean currency or credit.
That's correct. So again, it's evolved over history, but if we look at the Federal Reserve, which is involved in what we call a fiat currency or a currency of the dollar that's backed by the U.S. government, but also the amount of money in circulation is actually more than the outstanding debt of the U.S. government. So to an extent, there's an implicit trust, which is why we call it a fiat currency, as opposed to a hard coin currency like a gold or silver currency, which is electronically created nowadays and then basically attributed to the banking system, and that goes through to the general financial system of the country, in our case, the U.S.
Should bankers and politicians have this relationship that is so intimate, which allows them a first mover advantage in terms of credit?
Well, if it were pure, in other words, if the relationship were such that banks were purely the go-betweens of the central bank and the rest of the economy, or the citizens and the small businesses, the medium businesses, the growth requirements from a financial perspective and development of the country, then it would be okay. The problem is that, for example, the Fed was created in order to first and foremost, and it still does, provide liquidity or provide effectively financing of last resort to the largest private banks. The private banks are members of the Fed. They receive dividends from the Fed. They rotate on boards of directors, particularly at the New York Fed, which is the Fed that's located in the Wall Street area. And so they have undue influence, which they use to benefit themselves. And so what's happened in practice, rather than theory, or rather than how the Fed was constructed and promoted to the public, is that it really is an emergency measure for banks to utilize when they get into trouble. Now, originally it was created by bankers, as well as a senator from Rhode Island, Nelson Aldrich, who was the head of the equivalent of the Senate Finance Committee back in the 1910s. It was established by an act in 1913. But before that, it was basically created in concert with a group of bankers who are from what are now the largest banks in the country, and facilitated by J.P. Morgan, who was running the Morgan Bank, which at the time was the most prominent bank in the country, particularly for the richer class, and particularly working with the government very closely, and had been for decades before the Fed was created. And it worked on an act, ultimately, that was passed, but in prior versions of that act, that benefited them because there had been a major financial crisis or panic in 1907, and these bankers were very scared that they wouldn't have the ability to finance themselves and continue to operate if there weren't some other elements, what we ultimately have as a central bank reserve system, to provide them reserve money, to provide them reserve currency, to be there in the case of emergencies. And that's really how the Federal Reserve has evolved. In different countries, it's slightly different, but the European Central Bank, for example, which is the newest of the central banks in terms of having been created to do the same role with respect to the Eurozone, really benefits these banks and articulates that they benefit the overall economy. But the reality is banks are pretty, selfish. They do operate for their own profit. They don't operate for the general good. I mean, if that makes them money, then they do. But it's not their job. It's not their mission. And so you have this misalignment between what the Fed does and the influence that these bankers, and they also have influence over the government, have over what the Fed does to benefit themselves.
We've talked about this many times on our other interviews, and of course, we focus on this topic in the newsletter because when the banks distort the free market, opportunities emerge. This is what being a speculator is all about. Next week, we will be featuring, for instance, an incredibly undervalued zinc company, and central banks suppressed commodity prices for years, but now it's getting out of their hands. Nomi, are central banks national, or are they intertwined and codependent so much that it's basically one beast with a number of tentacles?
It's one beast with a number of tentacles, and maybe with some stronger tentacles than others. For example, the Federal Reserve, the central banks that are responsible for the major countries, in particular G7 countries, are the ones that have the most power. They do operate in concert, even though generally how they are covered by the news media, by financial news and so forth, is that, for example, the Fed raises rates, or if the ECB cuts rates or whatever, it's articulated as being done for that particular region, that country, that set of nations. But in reality, because we have such a global marketplace, because currencies are in such flux on an instantaneous basis, because reserves of one bank to another bank, one central bank to another bank, are so important in the operation of the individual countries and international financial markets, that there really is what I call a collusion or a concert cooperation, whatever word you want to associate with it, but overall international perspective, particularly amongst the central banks. Now, the smaller central banks, if we get to countries that have more of an issue with respect to the level of their rates, higher inflation, are less able to operate on as prominent a scale as the larger central banks in larger countries, tend to have central banks that are more focused on their own economies. But in terms of the larger ones, they operate in concert. That's why in the last 10 years, the Federal Reserve was the first mover in terms of bringing rates down to zero in the wake of our financial crisis that they started to do in 2008 and have continued effectively to do until the end of 2015, from which they've been raising rates a little bit each year in order to try and stabilize what they've done for a decade. But that manifested in rates going to zero or even negative throughout the world. So you have negative rates in Europe. In a number of countries, ECB has rates at negative. The Bank of Japan, Central Bank of Japan, has rates at negative. And so really that constitutes a coordinated effort to keep the level of the price of money low, to keep liquidity in the system, to provide banks the emergency funding that it was promoted as in the beginning of the crisis, but years later you have to question whether that's just an emergency or status quo. I think it's status quo. But it helps facilitate banks and therefore their customers, hedge funds, private equity funds, and so forth, to speculate on a massive scale with this cheap money. So it's a complicated answer perhaps to your question, but the reality is these central banks operate nationally, but they also operate internationally at the same time.
One of the major themes for 2018 that we are placing much effort on is the correlation between rising interest rates and a stock market top and a following recession. For 2 years, the Fed has been raising rates, now for the fourth time. The goal is also to shrink the balance sheet. But if easing allowed lowering of the debt burden, then raising rates is likely to overload borrowers right when Main Street is beginning to feel confident again. Is this done on purpose to choke liquidity and again have another massive transfer of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street?
Well, the debt burdens from a public perspective, from government debt, as well as corporate debt, as well as all those individual debts that you're talking about, are all at record highs. So what's happened in the first 8 years, but even really since the Fed started to raise rates a little bit, is that the level of debt throughout the world has just exploded. So what we are seeing now is debt burdens everywhere that are at epic highs. And so, yes, if rates were to be consistently and in a large incremental manner raised, that would put a substantial burden first on the smaller businesses that probably got worse terms comparatively to the larger businesses to begin with on their debt, to the corporations outside of the United States who also have a currency risk to their debt. So, for example, in Brazil or in Mexico or parts of Eastern Europe and so forth, where the borrowing levels, even at these low rates, were higher comparatively than certain other countries or certain larger institutions were able to get. So when those payments increase, and if there is a currency element, so the level of the currency, for example, related to the dollar decreases, then yes, they will have a higher debt problem in terms of repaying or furnishing their debt. This is why, though, the Federal Reserve, even though it has been raising rates a little bit, and going back to your prior question, has been working in concert with the other major central banks to make sure that money in general is at very low rates, zero to negative, throughout the world. That kind of gives an out to some of these other problems in other countries, because what the Fed doesn't want to do is create a scenario where there's a market crash, where they have another major credit event like we had acutely between the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, where they have to go back in and do massive amounts of more quantitative easing and more with respect to interest rates, which are already so low, there's not really enough room to do much with them. And then they would have to admit that this entire almost decade-long project, which they considered an emergency to begin with, of low rates and quantitative easing or purchasing of bonds and equities in the market to keep the level of rates low, which is another aspect of what they've done, was a complete failure. In other words, that it didn't really create sustainable growth, that it didn't really create sustainable markets, and in fact, all it did was create bubbles everywhere. So there's not really a desire to crash the system in that way. However, if rates were raised too much too quickly, that would be what would happen. And that's why I believe that despite some of these rate hikes in the U.S. by the Federal Reserve over the last couple of years, and anticipated to come a few more this year, they are keeping their balance sheet pretty big. It's at $4.45 or $4.9 or so trillion. That's an awful lot of bonds that they've bought to keep rates low and to effectively artificially increase the prices of these bonds, and therefore the prices at which the banks who effectively sold these bonds to the Fed for cash can mark their other bonds at in comparison. They're not really shrinking their balance sheet. They're talking about it, but the numbers, the actual balance sheet, the incremental reduction is minuscule. So they're saying one thing, and they're doing a little bit to supposedly normalize the system that they've inflated, but they're not really in a position to do that, because it would hurt not just people. I don't really think that's their concern, but it would look really bad cosmetically if the markets crashed, and it would look really bad cosmetically, and actually if all of the banks they've been supporting were to get choked up again.
Nomi, I've owned physical precious metals in vaults in my main residence all my adult life. It's a major part of my safe havens portfolio, which I wrote about as a special report on our website, along with 4 additional layers of protection. Is there any reason not to own some precious metals in today's world?
I don't think so. I mean, I own silver. I recommend gold as well. I tend to buy silver because it's just cheaper, and I think that the correlation is fairly positive in their use values, and it's at ridiculously low rates. And I think part of that, and why it's actually a better time to own or to get involved, say 5 to 10% of the money that you have investable in precious metals and in hard assets. because if any of this choking does happen, if any of these central banks misstep, if anything goes on from a geopolitical perspective or even from a financial institution perspective that could cause an economic or financial emergency from these levels, it could be very, very painful to lots of people. And the value in hard assets is that they are real, that they're not sort of debt that's been produced because rates have been artificially lowered. They're actually physical, touchable investments and hold their value as such. And for example, with gold, a lot of the central banks outside of the sort of U.S. purview and the sort of Western central bank purview of the European Central Bank, and even to an extent the Bank of Japan, which sort of is connected more to the Fed and more to the European Central Bank than, for example, the People's Bank of China or the Russian Central Bank or any of those. I mean, those central banks have been buying more gold, and they've been doing that for really two reasons. One is a hedge against the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, and therefore the sort of power that and influence that the U.S. Federal Reserve or the U.S. government has over currency, over international trade flows, over the international markets. And so there's this outside set of purchasers of gold, which I think will continue to buy it, and that will continue to give a bid to it. So from an investment standpoint, you always want to know that there's demand for certain things, and in this particular case, there is external demand for gold for strategic reasons, really, to be bigger players in the world economy and to diversify relative to the dollar or to the euro. And also just the fact that you can't create gold or silver out of thin air. So when we talk about investing in those things, which are smart to do, particularly for the long haul, is that you also disconnect from that idea of the production of speculative money, even that goes into the stock market and lists stocks artificially because it's coming from a source that's not real. And so there isn't any reason not to own those things. In fact, I actually am looking for birthday presents for my niece and nephew, upcoming birthdays in the next couple of weeks. And I think, for example, silver coins are a really good and kind of inexpensive present, but that have a lot of upside value. Just like, so when I was a kid, my grandparents would get me U.S. savings bonds at like discounted rates. And, by the time you were older, they all of a sudden seemed like a lot of money. And I think that's the case with things like silver and gold.
Nomi, when the next recession hits, will the wealth disparity in America influence populism further? In other words, is the country unified enough to withstand a crisis, or will we see the real face of all of the frustration and hatred that is currently, beneath the surface? Are you worried about the fabric of society coming apart?
Oh, absolutely. One of the reasons that there has been heightened wealth inequality in the world during this period of low rates and central bank intervention is that it opens so much potential damage, additional damage, in the event that there's a downturn, in the event that there's a recession or a crash or, an unforeseen cause of a crash. Because, first of all, a lot of people aren't sort of invested in this wealth accumulation. It really has gone to the top, not just in the U.S., but globally, within countries and between the richer countries to begin with. For example, in Europe, you have the Western European countries. Countries like Germany have done a lot better than countries like Italy or countries like Spain in the wake of this financial crisis and how the European Central Bank has intervened. It's the same thing in the U.S. We have a much larger inequality gap. Wages haven't increased anywhere near what the stock market has increased. Neither has participation in the labor force. What has increased is really the debt burdens that people have had to take on to sort of stay in step. We still have a situation where many people are living paycheck to paycheck. And so if there's another fall, all of those people are severely damaged financially. And the older they are, the less time they have that's just in general in any recession, but particularly when you're dependent on the wealth accumulation of others in sort of the more bubble markets, you don't have as much time to make up for that. And so therefore you do turn to blaming, and whether that's blaming your neighbor who got a job that you didn't get, whether that's blaming another country, whether that's blaming the government who should be regulating all of this better. It does also filter into that feeling of sort of helplessness and fear and anger. And so if we do have another large financial crisis, and nothing's been fixed since the last one, so there's no reason to assume that won't happen. It's really just a question of time. It could really cause another ripple of major nationalism and xenophobia and all of the negative things that come from economic fear and economic panic.
What's your solution then? Is it to take the power of issuing currency away from central banks and give it back to the government, like in the Constitution? Is it a gold standard? If so, then how will a modern gold standard look like? If it's cryptocurrencies or a privately issued currency, then are we looking at a complete renaissance of how the global economy functions? Is it even doable with the current situation and the influence that central banks have over the world? How do you view a potential solution?
Well, there's a couple things going on. One is that central banks have fully overstepped the boundaries of the mandates we discussed several minutes ago, in that they're not just creating a supply in an emergency. They're not regulating as well as they should be regulating. And even though some of the unemployment figures are better, the participation in the labor force is at 4-decade lows. So there haven't been a lot of fixes to the general foundation of the economy that have come from these central bank inflations of money, of their balance sheets, and reductions in rates to keep things flowing. It's really been negative. So, I mean, the problem is, though, that you can't just raise rates because, as we've also discussed, that hurts a lot of people in a lot of countries very quickly. I think there needs to be a significant program of debt reduction in the manner of deflating this leverage, and it should come from the bottom up. I mean, it should be for the weaker countries, it should be for the smaller businesses, it should be for individuals, because that's the gift that banks received when they got money at the cheapest levels in history by these central banks. And so whether that's the Fed taking a sort of counter role to what they've done in the last 10 years and other central banks to do something like that, which they're not going to do, but I mean that would be a way to mitigate the damage that's currently been inflicted by leverage into the system, or giving it back to, I kind of don't really trust the Treasury Department either, because the Treasury Department has really been a cheerleader in what the Fed has done, and Congress hasn't really done a great job of thinking of ways to regulate the system and to mitigate the potential of banks who've received all of this free or cheap liquidity to give back to the economy, to necessitate sort of growth and development and infrastructure and job creation projects. There's been no direct link. So I think the more important thing is to link the two. It's to look at the debt bubbles we have everywhere and consider ways to deflate those. It is ultimately to raise rates, but you can't do one without the other because that hurts sort of all the debt burden that's been created because of the policies that have been done. So I think there's a lot there, but I also think the system's changing from simply being dollar-centric, the global monetary system, to having other currencies work with each other. For example, China and Russia doing deals that are in the yuan and the Chinese currency and so forth. Trade agreements where the currency pretty much stays within the countries in that agreement as opposed to being dependent on the dollar. So there's kind of this general diversification going on globally, which I think will continue and change the monetary system. So when you look at the gold standard compared to that shift, I think it would be beneficial, not necessarily return to the former gold standard immediately, but to have a sort of connection to the level of gold that's part of, for example, the IMF currency basket. That basket used to just include the British pound, the Japanese yen, the US dollar, and now the euro. And so now it also includes the Chinese yuan. And the reason for that is that the Chinese decided they didn't want to be pegged to the dollar, and they didn't want to be pegged to U.S. Fed influence in the monetary system. And so to diversify, they pushed the IMF to say, we get to be included too. And they won that battle a couple of years ago. And so now, this is one of the reasons they're stockpiling more gold. I think what they and other sort of outside of the U.S.-centric powers want to do is have something else that is independent of currency creation and central bank influence, like gold, that can be used to sort of act as a foundation for currency fluctuations and the just sort of electronic production of currency and money. And so I think some return to a connection to gold, or honestly, even a basket of hard assets can be something that we could do creatively, could reduce the volatility of currencies, and it could reduce the influence that central banks have over currency. And I think ultimately that would create a more stable global economy.
Lastly, Nomi, please share with us the details of your new book and where we can get a copy online.
Well, the book's called Collusion: How Central Banks Rigged the World, and actually discusses some of the things that we've been talking about over the last half hour. What I did, and I tend to go on the ground to do my research. I did that with my last book, All the President's Bankers. I went to all of the presidential libraries and looked at examined documents from decades ago in terms of trying to piece together the domestic and international influence that bankers have on the presidency, on the government. And I sort of expanded that idea in terms of central banks and the world economies by going to Mexico, to Brazil, to China, Japan, throughout Europe and so forth, to look at how their central banks operate from an individual relationship basis, how they've impacted markets over the last decade, how they've overstepped those boundaries, how that impacts real people, real sentiment, real economic growth or lack thereof. And I put that together in a book that sort of goes through the years since the financial crisis, so it goes over current history, as well as this geography of the world in terms of the codependencies, as well as the infights, as well as the elite relationships amongst central bank leaders. So I name a lot of names in the book. I talk a lot about the local as well as international impact of these central bank policies, the individual impact as well as the corporate and private bank impact. And I'm pretty excited about it. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of traveling. It was a lot of research. A lot of sitting down and figuring out what to cut. I had a great team of researchers around the world who helped me translate, source documents from Chinese and Portuguese and so forth into English. And so that book is available right now for pre-order. It's available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, on Indie Books, which is, if you're interested in supporting sort of your local bookstore, you can pre-order it there. And it will be out on May 1st. It's called Collusion.
Thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.
This was a phenomenal education with Nomi Prins. For years, one of the subjects I love to dive into is economic systems, cycles, and history. As we're doing this interview, the US is reporting accelerated inflation numbers, and this does not come as a surprise because the fastest growing states in terms of GDP are Texas, Oklahoma, and Michigan, whereas growth is picking up, and soon commodities will be the best performing assets. 2018 is the year of precious metals and industrial metals. Gold is already at $13.38. Zinc is at a decade high. Make sure you become fully engaged in how to squeeze massive gains from this inflationary run-up. Go to wealthresearchgroup.com/gold playbook and wealthresearchgroup.com/crash to download our in-depth reports about the situation and to understand exactly how to position accordingly. In 2 weeks from now, I will be releasing my personal portfolio for 2018, no holds barred. Thanks for joining us today, and look forward for great interviews this year.